So I'd first like to thank everyone in attendance and tell you what I'm going to do in my speech. I'm going to start by going over and defining each term in the resolution, laying out our plan text, explaining what's going on in the status quo, and kind of laying out how this debate's going to go, and then bringing up two contentions. So starting my time now, the resolution reads, NATO should carry out a ground force military intervention in Syria. The terms are pretty self-contextual and they will be clarified in our plan. So NATO is the North Atlantic Trade Organization. It's basically a union of Western countries. It's mainly a military organization used to make political goals. Should implies this is a policy round, so NATO will be taking out this action, and then carry out a ground force military intervention in Syria will be defined through our plan text. So in our plan, we're going to send 300,000 troops to Syria to try to overthrow Assad and set up a democratic elections to make a parliamentary system of government, which is what the rebels are calling for. This is estimated to cost up to $300 billion. This is the maximum cost. It's probably not going to cost as much, just so everyone can evaluate properly. And they're going to try to get out as soon as possible. So we're trying not to make this a long-term war. It's estimated that when the West intervenes, Assad will fall very quickly, as he's pretty unstable right now. And so because of this, we're estimating it's not going to take that long to overthrow him. And we're going to, after that, significantly decrease the troop numbers and focus mainly on making sure that the parliamentary elections are fair and that all of the current rebel groups get a fair chance in winning. So to give you a summary of what's going on right now, what the likely realities are if you vote for the affirmation of the negation. Right now, so there's President Assad in Syria. There's a huge revolution that's turned into a civil war to try to overthrow him. And there are a variety of opposition groups who are trying to overthrow him, but have struggled to unite and be able to do this. It's pretty much inevitable that Assad is going to fall eventually. So we're assuming that the negation team here will accept that reality too, that Assad is probably going to eventually fall under this plan because he's so weak right now, really has no support from the international community, and these rebel forces are getting increasingly stronger. So essentially the reason that NATO would intervene is to end this conflict sooner and be able to have a larger role in setting up a more Western, more democratic state in Syria, which is what the rebel groups want. So if there are any questions about the plan text, I can take them now.
Okay, so your plan, just to be clear, is to first carry out a military intervention and then set up the government afterwards?
Yeah, the intervention involves setting up a government afterwards. So the intervention is two-part. The first part is to overthrow Assad and his regime, and the second part is to set up parliamentary elections. We think this works in the round because in any kind of NATO intervention, NATO doesn't just overthrow a dictator and leave. This isn't the way that the term works contextually. An intervention involves you're intervening in the problem. And the problem here is that Syria is not a democratic state, so intervention implies you're going to make the state more democratic, which requires staying to help make sure elections are free and fair. So now going into our two contentions. Our first is looking at short-term benefits to human rights, and our second is looking at future pro-Western sentiment and how this will benefit Syria as a whole. Syria will be the net benefits in this round. So looking at our first contention is short-term human rights. For each contention, I'm going to explain the harm, so what's going on right now, the links of how our plan benefits, and then the impacts, so what gets better. So first, the harm to human rights. There are two main harms that we're going to talk about here. First, people are dying, especially civilians. It's estimated there have been 70,000 deaths so far, but the numbers may be much higher because most of these deaths are not reported. Furthermore, we've seen over 1 million refugees leave Syria, most of them going to Lebanon and Jordan, and it's estimated that this number is going to triple to be 3 million pretty soon if no one does anything. This is a pretty big problem. We're seeing 7,000 new Syrians leaving every night to try to escape to these other countries to flee the violence. And this really isn't a good plan, one, for the Syrian people who are leaving. It's not like they're being treated well in these other countries. They're starving. They don't have any source of income. They don't have anything to do in these other countries. But it's also a burden to these other countries who are starting to get mad and probably won't take refugees in the future, as Lebanon's population has increased 10% because of the refugee problem. So we're seeing that, and furthermore, there are 4 million people who report that they need humanitarian assistance. There's a huge problem in Syria. People don't have food. People are dying. There's really no distinction between killing civilians and killing members of the armed forces. This is a huge problem for human rights. So the link here is that our plan ends the violence sooner than the status quo. We think that in the status quo, Assad will fall eventually, but it may take another year. We don't know exactly how long it'll take, and our plan ensures that the violence stops as soon as possible when we carry out this plan. So the link here is that we're stopping this violence. This is according to the Council on Foreign Relations. It's estimated that if NATO were to intervene, the violence would stop and the refugee problem would subside. So the impacts here is that A, we're going to stop refugees from leaving the country. There's really no reason to leave if we're about to set up a democratic government that's going to be better than the status quo. And B, many people will come back. So a lot of the refugees who have gone are just waiting for the violence to stop so they can come back and try to rebuild their homeland, which really can't happen in the status quo and can happen better if we have democratic elections with a government that's really trying to help the people. So subpoint C under this point is that we're going to save lives. We see people are dying every day because Assad is just brutally massacring them without really any care for who it is, if they're really involved in the conflict at all. So we're saving lives because of this plan, and saving lives is a key benefit that the negation team really isn't going to be able to attack here. Our second contention is looking at future pro-Western sentiment. So right now the harm is that there are a lot of the groups who are fighting to overthrow Assad are not really in favor of the West. They're saying the Western world isn't doing anything. The United States could help, France could help. There are lots of countries that could help us, and they don't care about us. They're not helping. And what this leads to is anti-Western sentiment. A lot of times when people, especially in the Middle East, think that the West isn't helping, they think the West is against them. And so in the future, when they form a government, they're not likely to be favorable towards the Western world, and they're also less likely to institute the democratic reforms that we want and that the people of Syria want. We're seeing a lot, some Islamic groups trying to come into power here because the people who are in the rebel groups don't have anyone to turn to. There's no source of money, no source of weapons, and so we see the threat of potentially turning to rebel groups if NATO doesn't, to Islamic rebel groups if NATO doesn't help. So this is the harm right now. And so the link here is that we're essentially giving them a win. We're saying here we will help you. This is what they want. They want the Western world to help. And so the link here is that we're going to improve our relationship with the future Syrian government. That if Assad is going to inevitably fall, it is best that the Western world has some say in the new government, has the approval of the regime, as opposed to no approval of the regime, and the group saying, well, we're in power now, the U.S. didn't help us, the Western world didn't help us, so we don't really have any, they wouldn't have any allegiance to the Western world if we weren't to help them. They would say, well, they didn't help us, we did this ourselves, we should do whatever they want. But it's actually better for Syria if the Western world is in favor of them. It's better if NATO is, because one, we're going to see more democratic elections, more democratic, more fair, because there's a larger body overseeing them who has experience doing this kind of thing. NATO is the best actor for this plan because they have experience going into countries militarily and making this kind of transition to democracy. The people want democracy. For an example of how you see political support increasing, in Libya, before the Libyan Revolution, support for the United States was at 15%, whereas after the Libyan Revolution, when the United States helped with crucial air force, approval was at 60%. We see the approval for the Western world increases, and we've seen Libya turn to the Western world, to NATO in general, for help with their elections, and we've seen many benefits for the people of Libya now that they have a relatively democratic government and they're progressing. So we're going to see the same kind of transition. We're going to see people who are against the West right now feel more favorably towards the West, like they did in Libya. This is beneficial for the people there because what they want is democracy, and they're less likely to be hijacked by groups who don't want democracy, as we could see a large power void if no one comes in to help. The main harm with the negations plan is you're going to see a big power void after Assad falls, and this could quickly be filled in with Islamic rebel groups or people who don't actually support democracy. So to ensure that the revolution, that the civil war was successful, all these people died for something, we must make sure that they get the democracy that they want. This is a unique benefit for the Syrian people because we are ensuring that they get the democracy they've been fighting for, that they've been dying for. So in this round, you should vote affirmation because A, there are short-term benefits to human rights for both the people who are dying and the refugees who are having a decreased quality of life, and B, we're going to see future pro-Western sentiment in a government that's more likely to be democratic. So I urge a strong vote for the affirmation.
Time. I'd like to thank everybody for being here. To give a brief overview, I'm going to go over an issue of extra topicality, abuse in terms of the weighting mechanism this round, and I'm going to be going into there are 2 points, and there are 2 points. Number 1 being strengthens counterinsurgency, number 2 being harms to relationship with Russia and why that's detrimental. So with that being said, I'll start my time. Thank you everybody for being here again. We jump right into this issue of topicality they're playing, or extra topicality. Their plan is essentially to send 3,000 ground troops in, and then after they do this, help restructure, rebuild the Syrian government by implementing this democratic government. Now the opposition team has 2 major problems with this. Number 1, the government should only be able to figure out what is given to them in the resolution. Now the resolution clearly states NATO should carry out a ground force military intervention in Syria. What a ground force military operation authorizes is that NATO can send ground force troops in to help aid in the fight against Bashar al-Assad. Nowhere in the resolution does it specifically talk about rebuilding or restructuring or helping implement some sort of democratic government in Syria. The resolution does just not authorize the affirmation to do so. And because the affirmation team is married to their advocacy, which is in fact the resolution, having them allowed to do so is not essentially ground force interventionism. Ground force interventionism is essentially just sending troops there. So of course, the B is the point right here talking about how they're talking about what we believe the interpretation should be. It should just simply be putting ground force troops in there because of course the reconstruction of Syria, reconstruction of their government is not a ground force intervention. There's inherently different. It's about interventionism and then afterwards reconstructing the government, which is inherently not given to them in the resolution or in their advocacy. Subpoint C here is the inherent abuses. Number 1 is talking about ground. So of course here what they're advocating for is advantages outside of what the resolution gives them. They're advocating for advantages in coming about with putting a democratic government, all the advantages that come from having democracy and they're having some democratic ally in the Middle East. But the resolution does not grant them that. They can assume that Syria. Maybe in the future that will happen, but they can't assume that there's going to be democratic government actually elected in place. All that they can assume is that they can actually put troops in there to put that. So it's inherently unfair because it takes away ground for us to argue in terms of the resolution. The other subpoint C is talking about predictability. This is inherently unpredictable. We believe that the affirmation team would just run exactly what the resolution talked about, 5 at the end of it too, which is essentially that NATO would put ground force troops in there. Now that they've completely twisted this around and saying that we're going to implement a new democratic government right now there, it's inherently unpredictable, which is inherently abusive to the negation team. And of course, subpoint D is that fairness in education, and inherently this is unfair and education to the negation team because of course it's unpredictable and takes away ground. Probably we'll get into that more in speech, and that's going to be more of a voter bigger issue. Going into this, the abuse talking about the weighing mechanism that's wrong, which is essentially benefits towards Syria. An actor only acts in its own self-interest, and this is pretty much NATO right here. NATO is acting in its own self-interest by actually going in to help the Syrian people. Now we believe that this resolution will be much more fair and much more topical, much more educational if we talked about net benefits as a whole. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to talk about net benefits as a whole, because first of all, NATO is clearly the actor here, so we should be talking about the benefits that extended them as well. And B, we should also be talking about net benefits as a whole, because I've bringing up a lot of good points about Russia that we're going to be talking about as well, and counterinsurgency, which affects the entire world. When you have a big terrorist buildup in Syria, as we're going to be talking about, then it affects the entire world. So cutting off the impacts of just talking about benefits and detriments in Syria inherently inhibits the educational value of this round. So of course we would like to extend that to net benefits to Syria, and it takes away the ground from negation team. Fairness and education will of course be our voter issues. Yes.
So what do you think the goal is of intervention in Syria?
Goal of intervention in Syria is to help topple the al-Assad regime. But just because the goal might be to implement a democratic government does not mean that they have the right to advocate for that as well. You can only have one fiat in parliamentary debate, and the resolution only gives you guys the ability to talk about putting in ground force troops regardless of whether or not that is their intended goal. Now, moving on to their first point. The first point talks about short-term human rights. It talks about how a bunch of refugees are leaving, how it's inherently bad, Lebanon's population is going up, and how a lot of people are dying. If NATO intervenes and sets up a military help, it'll essentially help stop these human rights abuses. Let's talk about the fact that when NATO often goes into countries, especially with ground force countries, not only do ground force troops often inhibit and mess up a lot of the aspects of daily life and carry out a lot of human rights abuses there, and two, they use military contractors a lot of the time. The reason why military contractors are bad is because they don't often have a lot of oversight. They don't have a lot of oversight by the actual militaries of NATO itself. So what happens is a lot of the time when we've used military contractors in the past, they do a lot of things like rapes, they do a lot of things like using very sexist language, they do a lot of things in terms of racism and stuff, and they do not promote a lot of equality and rights. So in terms of short-term human rights and long-term human rights, using military contractors, which is what NATO would probably most likely do, is inherently bad in the status quo, so you can actually turn that link. Moving on to their second tension, they talk about future pro-Western sentiment, how essentially they're angry at the U.S. for not intervening, and how they'd be more favorable to us essentially if we help them. I have three major responses to this. Number one, they wouldn't like us because of human rights abuses, because of course as we go in, if you cross-apply my refutation to their first point about NATO forces and military contractors being inherently abusive, they clearly wouldn't like it if we go and be racist, sexist, and rape a lot of the people who are currently in that country. They're clearly not going to like us there. Two, having ground forces and putting them in other countries inherently disrupts a lot of the lifestyle there. Look at Iraq, look at Iran. We put ground troops in there, we inherently messed up a lot of the lives of a lot of those people, and now a lot of those people hate us right now, so there's no link here as to why they would all like us. Number two, it creates a power schism. Right now, you have a lot of rebel groups, as I'll be talking about. 25% of all the rebel groups in Syria right now have links to terrorist organizations, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is actually separate, as I'll be talking about right now. So what this actually does is there's no reason to say they can. There's a warrant here that we're talking about that they might just be using United States interventionism and using NATO interventionism to gain control, get Bashar al-Assad out of power, and then use his power and use that power void there to take over control of the country. You know, even the Syrian opposition, revolutionary forces, has that 25% infiltration by terrorists. So essentially, what you can be seeing here is we create a power schism there. Let me just finish your refutation. Actually, I don't have a lot of time, so I have time at the end. Number three, they talked about Libya. The reason why Libya is inherently different is because Libya we just took and did an aerial strike. Right now, you're actually sending ground troops in, which is inherently disrupts the lives of a lot of these people. So it's a lot different. They don't even keep their Libya point intact. So now that I've refuted everything that they're talking about, let me go into our two contentions. Our first major contention is strengthens counterinsurgency. Subpoint A, uniqueness. 1/4 of all the Syrian rebels have connections to Hamas, Hezbollah, and this is all according to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And of course, all these terrorist organizations have infiltrated the Syrian opposition coalition. Uniqueness number two, al-Nusra, which has significant backing in Syria and has significant backing of at least 13 opposition organizations in Syria right now, is linked to the Syrian opposition, the major Syrian opposition group right now, but does not like the United States and is inherently linked to Al-Qaeda. Link here. NATO, one link. NATO presence in fighting against Bashar al-Assad, weakens Bashar al-Assad, thereby strengthening the opposition groups and thereby through popularity, support, and mobility. So it strengthens those opposition groups, strengthens that 25% of Hamas, Hezbollah in the Syrian opposition revolutionary forces. And it also strengthens directly Al-Qaeda by strengthening al-Nusra on the Nusra front. So the impacts here, number one, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations gain significant influence in that country. If you think Al-Qaeda is bad right now, just where they're operating scattered around the Middle East, imagine how bad they would be if they infiltrated an entire country and used all of the weapons and money at that disposal to attack the United States and attack Western interests. And the impacts that come out of that round are number one, destabilizing, because you destabilize the entire region. Number two, increased terrorism. Right now, it's increasingly important for us to have Syria as a base of a safe haven right now, considering the fact that you have countries like Iran, which are very unstable around there. You have countries like Israel and Palestine, which is very unstable areas. So if you increase terrorism right there and increase links to Hamas and Hezbollah, which can inherently harm Israel, so you can see inherent detriments right there. And number three, it's bad for human rights, considering the fact that Al-Qaeda and Hamas and Hezbollah have very little concern for human rights, no equality, no feminism, no anything like that. They're inherently detrimental to the human rights of their population, don't support minorities, and don't support women at all. By populating those groups and propping them up, you're inherently supporting those human rights abuses, so extend that link across. Number two, really fast, Trump's relationship with Russia. Unique is subpoint A. Russia supports Bashar al-Assad. Relations between NATO countries and Russia right now are equals good. Number one, because they're agreeing on anti-terrorism and pro-humanitarian front. And number two, because they're agreeing on a lot of economics fronts. Link, really fast. By aiding the Syrian opposition, you essentially make Russia mad, because Russia has a historical tendency, has historical regard to support Bashar al-Assad right now, so it will do so. Thereby you're making tensions go higher, because you're pitting NATO against the Russian opposition. Three impacts really fast. One, you're no longer collaborating on a lot of the fronts for fighting against proliferation, which because they're currently agreeing on anti-proliferation right now, you're currently increasing anti-proliferation. Number two, you're ending a lot of the infrastructure projects they're working on, which are inherently bad, so part we'll get into more on. And number three, you're harming research as well, including medical and space research that will impact millions and millions of lives around the globe. So for all these reasons, because our impacts clearly outweigh all of their impacts, the part we'll get into more in his speech, or strong vote for the negation side in today's round. Thank you.
Okay. Is everyone ready? I guess brief roadmap, and we go over this topicality argument, their case, then back into our case. All right, here we go. Thanks everyone for being here. It's pretty awesome to be here. So first off, I'm going to go over this topicality argument. So basically, our opponents are saying that we're taking away ground from their team and we're being extra topical. But when you really look to the resolution, NATO should carry out a ground force military intervention in Syria. You have to ask, why is NATO doing this? What is the goals of NATO? The goal of NATO is the establishment of the democratic regime. Historically, and really this link to unpredictability, and if we look to any intervention by a body throughout history, intervention in NATO, or even an intervention of the United States during the Civil War when the North intervenes in the South, you can see that a military force stays on after the topplement of a regime to ensure that a new regime takes place. I'm not sure why this is unpredictable, because obviously if NATO was to be doing this military intervention, the goal would be a pro-democracy regime. Our opponents never link any of their contentions to ground loss because of this. So first of all, you shouldn't be voting on this. And secondly, this is extremely predictable, because we can see that anytime any force intervenes in a country, it stays on to establish a new government. But also we can see that really NATO isn't doing anything extra. The military force is still remaining intervened in Syria, but the avenues of democracy already exist in Syria. They aren't being established by NATO. This NATO is not taking on an extra action. It is just the military force continues to intervene. So there's no extra action that's be taken on by NATO. Yes?
Okay, regardless of whether or not this is their intended goal, does the resolution specifically say should it carry out a ground force and then help restructure and rebuild their government? Does that give you that?
The resolution specifically states that NATO should carry out a ground force military intervention. We have to ask ourselves, as the affirmative, why is NATO doing this military intervention, and it wants to accomplish its goals. The goals here are, of course, the establishment of a new regime after Assad. And so this is why this is fair. This is why it is predictable. And when you really talk about fairness in education, never our opponents actually said why we were taking away the fairness nor the education of this round. This was never impacted. It was kind of claimed real fast. But since this is never impacted, you shouldn't be voting on topicality. Now, quickly, I'm going to go into our opponent's case, and they kind of they misinterpret our one of our main issues in that the longer this conflict goes on, these Islamic groups have a bigger and bigger influence in the opposition forces. Because the Syrians are seeing that this conflict is being prolonged, so they are turning to these al-Qaeda groups, anything that can help them, anything that can topple Assad, they are turning to it. So that's why we have seen that as this conflict goes on and on and on, these al-Qaeda groups are getting more and more influence. So by solving this issue once and for all, this whole thing about terrorist groups are infiltrating opposition, this is being solved. By the affirmation team, we are solving this because we are instituting a pro-Western influence, and we are stopping these opposition groups, these al-Qaeda funding groups, to get more and more influence. I'm sorry, I have a lot to get through. So what you can see in the world of the opposition is that eventually Assad falls. Our opponents kind of agree with this, that eventually Assad falls, but they never say what happens after. We have these al-Qaeda groups that are getting more and more influence, and when Assad does fall, after potentially millions of more Syrians have died, now we have a completely controlled al-Qaeda government. Instead of the affirmative team, we have a government that is more Western influence and more democratic, and it is ensured to be democratic. So all these huge impacts of the al-Qaeda groups getting more influence and more influence. This is actually all being solved by the affirmation because we're ending this conflict before the al-Qaeda groups can get any more impact. The next thing, our opponents kind of bring up the human rights abuses of NATO going in, but there's no human rights abuse that is worse than the Assad regime. We can see that, of course, the Assad regime is suppressing democracy. He is directly hurting his own people. He's forcing them to leave their homes, and he's threatening to use biological weapons. So any potential human rights abuses by NATO are much smaller than the continuation of the Assad regime. The next thing I want to talk about is the harms relations with Russia. Our opponents are kind of claiming that all of a sudden NATO and Russia will basically hate each other because of this plan, but this isn't true. Since NATO kind of comprises all these countries that have such a huge economic influence, there's no reason that Russia would cut off ties with all these important countries in NATO. Secondly, Syria, as the Assad regime goes on and on and on, it's more of an embarrassment for the Russian Federation. I'm sorry, I have a lot to get through. And it's more and more of an embarrassment, and we can see that by ending this conflict now, we can kind of resolve this embarrassment for everyone. So there's really no link that Russia would stop negotiating and working with NATO because NATO is so important on the world stage. Next, I want to talk about our case, and I want to bring up two important things that are not even addressed by the opposition team. And the first is the fact of refugees, and the second is lives. Now, basically, our opponents kind of concede that we're ending this Assad regime and we are saving lives. People are dying in Syria because of this ongoing civil war, and this is something that our opponents never even contend. So because the affirmation team is stopping the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Syrians, you must be voting for the affirmation because it is good for Syrians. Secondly, it is good for the world. It is good for Jordan and Turkey as well, because as more and more refugees go into Jordan and Turkey, it's putting an economic strain on these countries, and it's undermining the stability in both of these countries. We can look to the 1973 Black September War in Jordan, and when we saw Palestinian refugees came into that country, and they undermined the stability in that country, and we actually had civil war. So unless we stop this, we could see this civil war and instability spread out of Syria into the whole Middle East. And this is something that's never brought up by the opposition team, so you should be flowing this through the round, and you should be voting on this. Our opponents kind of say that NATO uses military contractors, which are bad. First, this is not true. NATO does not use military contractors, so don't even think about this in the round. Secondly, any small sexist comments by a military contractor are much better than the continual Assad regime. Which is, of course, much worse for human rights abuses. So the next thing I want to talk about is the future pro-Western government. And again, our opponents kind of misunderstand what this means. They misunderstand that if the West gets is better in the eyes of the Syrian Republic, we have less of the influence of these al-Qaeda groups. And they misunderstand this, and they never rebut this. And that we're combating the influence of these al-Qaeda groups because the West and democracy and all the things that are valued by NATO have a bigger influence in Syria. The longer this conflict goes on, the farther Syria gets away from the West. And of course, we see benefits for the whole world. Of course, we see the Syrian benefits of the eventual establishment of a safe and stable regime. And we also see the benefits of better trade in the future between these Western nations and Syria, which improves everyone, not only Syria. So for all these reasons, I urge a strong vote for the affirmation.
So I'm going to go first over extra T and then the abuse with the weighing mechanism, which was just dropped in the round. And then I'm going to go over, I'll go over our case, and then I'll go over their case. Okay, so is everyone ready to get started? And of course, let's congratulate O'Dowd for both of us making it this far. It's really exciting to be here right now. So, let's get started with extra topicality. Our issue here is that they're essentially fielding two different things. First, a military intervention, and then the government coming in afterwards. I'd like to point out this is essentially very different. What we did in Iraq, for example, is first we had the military intervention, and then afterwards we planned the rebuilding of the government. They required two different agencies and two different actors. First, the military comes in and does something. Then afterwards, the State Department comes in and tries to rebuild the military, or rebuild the government. I'm sorry. They're both very different. And we look to the resolution today, the only thing they gain access to is a ground force military intervention. Nothing in that makes any sense regarding to the rebuilding of a government. When you think of a ground force military intervention, you don't think of a NATO setting up a viceroy or anything like that to recreate the government. They're inherently different, so they shouldn't get any access to that. The response to this is that, no, thank you right now. The response to this is that military intervenes, not doing anything extra because of the fact that's just how we naturally work out. However, we don't really think that this is the way the debate should be playing out right now. We should be debating the effect of whether or not NATO intervening is a good thing or not, whether or not they will be able to successfully create a government. Essentially what they're doing is fiating first that the military intervention will be successful, and then afterwards that the NATO will be able to create a government on its own in Syria. And we think that that's not something they should gain access to because of the fact that it really takes away a lot of our ground, because of the fact that we should be gaining a lot of access to arguments like a power void after the intervention comes into place, or arguments like that they just try to cut off access to us right off the bat. So first of all, they're taking away a lot of ground for this. Also, they're taking away predictability because of the fact if you let the affirmative team just add parts to their case during the prep time that the opposition team couldn't predict, what's going to happen now is that affirmation teams are just going to be able to do this whenever they want and just add things to their case that we know that we wouldn't be able to prepare for, and they'll just start winning rounds on just completely and utterly every single time because of the fact that they have this prepared. And ultimately what this means is that debate as a sport will really be ruined because of the fact that the affirmative team gets such a strong advantage. I'm not going to take any questions right now. I'll go after I go through here. Theory. So the reason you're going to be voting on this, first of all, is fairness. When you look to any competitive thing, you as a judge have to be judging fairness first. We believe that both teams should have a 50-50 ground in this round, in this debate, in order to have a fair debate and see who actually is the better debater. What the affirmative team is doing is getting away this opportunity for us and just saying that the fact that they set this debate up abusively, they get to win the round because of the fact that they're using two fiats, two different actors within NATO. First of all, the military to intervene, and then second of all, some other body to rebuild it. And then the second thing is they're getting rid of education because of the fact that they're denying a lot of clash in this round, and that's really the only thing that makes debate unique as an educational event is this whole clash of ideas. And by rejecting the possibility of clash, by adding arguments that we really wouldn't be able to prepare for really good arguments against, really is abusive against us as well and reduces the educational value of this round, which is the whole reason debaters exist. Now let's go over the weighing mechanism. This was completely dropped in this round, so essentially the government team is conceding that they're being abusive with the way they've interpreted this resolution. Essentially what they started off this round is saying that we should be debating this whether or not it benefits Syria or not. We think that they should be looking at the entire world and the global ramifications of this. We said so because of the fact that it takes away a lot of ground. We have a lot of disadvantages about how it affects NATO, about how it affects Russia and our relationship there, and how it affects the entire world. And they don't think that we should be getting access to that just because it's more convenient for them to be just defending Syria. And for that reason as well, they're being really abusive in that sense. So we should be voting for them as well. And this is something that they actually agree with. Again, they're hurting fairness and education in this round. So we're really winning this round. Before you look at this debate itself, you're going to be voting pre-fiat on topicality and the abuse of the weighing mechanism. We win there. With that being said, let's go off case. So our off case. So our first disadvantage is that terrorists will gain more power. And they said that we have to stop the war now in order to reduce the power because every single day that the war is going on, they're establishing even more power within the country. I'd like to point out that al-Nusra has already established itself as the leader of Syria. So they're not saying that every single day they're going to establish themselves. I'm saying that they've already established themselves as really the prominent presence in Syria. And this is really a bad thing because of the fact that they're essentially an al-Qaeda front. And what this means is that they're going to get, by overthrowing the government, by overthrowing Bashar al-Assad, what they're doing is essentially handing the government over to al-Qaeda. And this is really bad for the reasons that Caitlin brought up in her speech that were never really responded to. They never really hit our impacts. They just hit our link, which that gives strength to al-Qaeda. We already responded to that. They've already established. People actually protest in favor of al-Nusra all the time, sign petitions saying that they want al-Nusra in Syria and that they're really pro al-Nusra. So what's going to happen here is that the influence in that country is going to go up, which means that al-Qaeda now has a base of operations in a country, which means that they have access to a military and they have access to infrastructure and things like that, which will mean that they have a lot more power in anti-Western sentiments and their attacks going on there. So to vote for the affirmation team is and vote for giving al-Qaeda its own country, which means that it will be more successfully commit crimes against humanity in the long term, harming human rights. Yeah.
What do you think will happen to that group under your plan, or under the status quo?
What do you mean?
What will happen with that group and the groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda under the status quo?
I'm a little bit confused with what you're asking right now. Essentially what we're saying is that by having this intervention go into effect, what's going to happen is that so essentially it's going to stay the same. However, what we're doing here is that by the U.S. giving more influence into it, they're making it a lot easier for this country, for this to gain power. We think that right now, with the lack of intervention happening, when Bashar al-Assad is overthrown without NATO presence there, the international community is going to be a lot more active in rebuilding Syria in a different way, and that will be less al-Nusra. Now, our second disadvantage, Russia. It's talking about Russia. They talk about how Russia's embarrassed, so they're not going to be supporting us in the long term. If Russia was embarrassed, they already would have come out of support for Bashar al-Assad. So we could really see here that this link doesn't make sense because it would have happened a long time ago if that were the case. So because of this, they really don't have any arguments against our link, which means that we gain access to our impact, which we believe a lot larger magnitude than anything going on in Syria because of the fact that Syria is just one country in the world with this conflict going on, and we agreed it's bad. We think that Russia-U.S. relationships are a lot more important for the following reasons. First of all, they collaborated against violence and anti-terrorism units, and also the reduction of nuclear weapons. If Russia continues to be mad at the United States, what they will do is continue to rearm and create more nuclear weapons and provide more support to other countries creating nuclear weapons against the United States. And nuclear proliferation is bad because it increases the likelihood of an explosion going off, and also the magnitude of that explosion actually happening because there's going to be more bombs that are going to be able to go off. So a vote for the affirmation team is an increased probability of a nuclear war happening because of the fact that Russia has more power. The second thing that we need to talk about today is the fact that both countries are currently collaborating on a lot of infrastructure and research going in, like medical research, like research on mining into asteroids, like a tunnel between the Bering Strait to make oil easier to trade. So ultimately what's happens here is when we look to international stability and the economy being able to exist, we need to have good relationships between the United States and Russia. And that goes away in their plan, and they don't have any response to why that will actually happen. So you can extend those across the flow as well. Now I'm going to go quickly into on case. The first is that it ends violence. We respond to the fact that NATO commits a lot more crimes, and they said that Bashar al-Assad is worse. First of all, we have two responses to this. First of all, we don't think that's true because of the fact that whenever NATO goes into a country and occupies it, they do things like kidnap, they do things like torture, they do things like rape that really go unresponded to. Bashar al-Assad is going to be held accountable for these crimes. NATO is not, because of the fact that they're going to be the people holding them accountable. And we look historically, that's actually not what happens. They just let people go off scot-free, which means that this violence will continue to happen. That's why it's different, and that's why it's worse, because of the fact that they have more ability to do so, and they're going to get away with it. Also, we can see that by having NATO go in, anti-Western sentiment is going to be stronger and last a lot longer, which means that human rights abuses will continue against the Western world as well. So we have a two-front reason as to why more human rights abuses will go on in their world. Their second contention was about future pro-Western sentiment. They didn't really respond to all of our responses about human rights abuses. Even if you don't believe that PMCs are going to go in, the fact of the matter is American soldiers also do this. A lot of NATO soldiers actually do this as well, and aren't really found accountable for that. So they're going to be doing that as well. Also, we can see that it's not going to be pro-Western sentiment because occupation creates resentment against the Western world. What happens here is that when we occupy their country, tell them how to live and interact them and interrupt them in their everyday life, they're going to feel resentment against the United States. So they're actually increasing the probability of future anti-Western sentiment in the long term. So you're going to be voting negative today for the following reasons. First of all, before you look at the flow, they've been abusive and extra-topical in their weighing mechanism as well. You're going to be extending our disadvantages across the flow as problems that are unique to their plan, and ultimately you can see that they have no benefits, they actually just make the situation worse. So for all these reasons, I urge you oppose today. Thank you.
Before I begin my time, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. Very exciting night. I just have two brief remarks. I'm really just going to get going into voter issues. I report this is off time right now. Okay, sorry. So 4 major voter issues. Number 1 is the extra topicality and by extension the abuse argument. Second is stability. Third is Western sentiment and democracy. And fourth is human rights.
Oh, slow down.
First is extra topicality. Second, it will be extra topicality and abuse. Second is stability. Third is Western sentiment and democracy. And fourth is human rights. Okay. So, starting my time now, just into this issue of extra topicality, my partner's pretty much already talked about this last speech why they're being extra topical. The pretty much only responses is that you can't go into a plan, you can't start a plan or a military intervention without having some sort of goal in mind to implement a new government. But just because they say that, just because a military intervention, some kind of military intervention might want to have some sort of goal, it doesn't mean that the resolution gives them that ability or gives them that advocacy in order to advocate for that status quo. It just doesn't. It does not give them the power of two fiats. One to feel that they can have military intervention, military troops, and one to feel that they can implement a new government. It just doesn't, regardless of whether or not they have a goal. Now, with that being in mind, we have to look at the real-world impacts, and partner already talked about. Number 1 being fairness, number 2 being education. And what you really have to look at here today, judges, is the fact of the matter that yes, we're debating a lot of different things about stability, Western sentiment, democracy, all these big things, but the major impacts of this round about fairness and education extend beyond just the world that we're talking about here and extend into the big world of parliamentary debates who have real-world impacts. In terms of fairness, they're essentially taking extra ground and extra benefits by advocating for something that's outside of what the resolution actually gives them access to talk about. Number 2, in terms of education, there's minimal clash right now and minimal educational value to everybody in this room because they've taken extra arguments beyond what the resolution gives them to that my partner and I have had no time to prep about. They've kind of cut us off in terms of our Russian plans as well, which means there's minimal clash because we have minimal ability to clash and talk about these arguments because we have no time to really predictability and prep on these kinds of things. The reason why these things are detrimental and harmful is because if you vote on the affirmation team and let them win all this time, then you're going to be allowing every affirmation team and setting a bad precedent, negative precedent for every affirmation team to essentially win in the future, which means that if every single team wins only 50% of the time, no one's going to want to debate in parliamentary debate anymore because you're letting affirmation teams continuously be abusive. You're essentially ruining the state of parliamentary debate as a whole because, of course, if people aren't fair and educational and topical and any sort of thing, no one's going to want to debate anymore. So you should be voting on us in fairness and education in that sense. But I won't belabor that point. Moving into the point about stability, while we're voting on stability, for two major reasons. Number 1 is about the terrorist influence in Syria right now. Number 2 is about the Russian stability that's really been gone unrefuted by the affirmation team this round. In terms of the stability, in terms of the terrorist threat in Syria. We're talking about over 25% of the opposition, Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, already have power in Syria right now. This strengthens the counterterrorism effort, or strengthens counterinsurgency effort as a whole. So what they're advocating for is if they give NATO troops essentially help and assist in this effort, they're essentially boosting up and making the counterinsurgency people powerful. What they're talking about now is implementing this great democratic, so even if you're not by our actual Topicality argument, you buy into the fact that they're implementing this great new grand democratic government, but the fact of the matter is, even if they implement this democratic government, 25% of that opposition grand democratic government has terrorist threats, has terrorist ties and terrorist threats. It doesn't support democracy, doesn't support the value of equality, doesn't support the right of feminism. So all their democratic things that they're talking about, all their democratic ideals won't even be happening in the first place because 25% of the group doesn't even support democracy in the first place. So they can't fiat or ensure that the government will actually support democracy. Second, so we're winning on that argument, is winning on the fact that having a terrorist organization have such a strong influence in a country is actually incredibly destabilizing for the region, so we should not be voting on them. And two, in terms of Russian instability, we're talking about partnering impact out to nuclear war here. The fact of the matter is relationships between NATO and Russia are very strong right now. They're actually agreeing on all things like counterterrorism and humanitarian efforts. What happens now is that if NATO takes an active stance to support the opposition group, what happens now is that Russia will try to support Bashar al-Assad because they have historical connections to do so. This means that they will no longer agree on things like on nuclear proliferation, that kind of thing, which mean that as an extension, both sides will start to build up, and both sides will start to build up their sides to the opposition forces, which is incredibly detrimental because it ruins stability as a whole. We're already seeing a nuclear conflict between North Korea and us right now. The last thing we want to do is see a superpower militarize and superpower build up nuclear weapons because we no longer have this peacekeeping agreement that's been lasting since the end of the Cold War. So really what they're talking about here is an extension of a loss of stability to the entire world, so you should be voting us on that. But now I'm going to move into human rights really fast. The major impact that they really have in this round, they're really advocating for is human rights to refugees and human rights to individuals in Syria as a whole. All of their impacts pretty much revolve around Syria, helping the Syrian individuals and Syrian people. Yes, we agree that they have some value to their human rights points, they have some valid points, but we believe that our humanitarian, our human rights points outweigh theirs for two major reasons. Number one, because they never refuted our talking points about the Russian-NATO partnership. The Russian-NATO partnership agrees on a lot of are talking about things like human rights and trying to help in humanitarian efforts as a whole. So we believe that actually outweighs. And second of all, in terms of military contractors. So yes, we believe that military contractors and all the bad things that they're doing creates an anti-West sentiment against the United States there, which doesn't aid in the democratic world that they're talking about, and B, creates a lot of fuel for the terrorist organizations that are already there. So really we can see that the values of human rights that are going to affect by A, allowing these terrorist organizations to thrive when they don't support human rights, and two, because you're allowing military contractors to essentially go and have a lot of human rights abuses in that country as a whole, far outweighs any of the human rights things that they're talking about. And one, because of magnitude, and two, because of probability, because we know that terrorist organizations right now are already doing so. Now moving on to this Western sentiment and democracy issue. They never respond to the fact that terrorist organizations are essential. When I brought up my first point, I brought up my first point, the fact that terrorist organizations are probably using the West in order to gain power in this country, gain power in Syria. They never responded to this fact, which essentially means that they concede this point. The fact of the matter is they assume that in this fantasy world, that even if you don't buy our Topicality argument, they assume that this grand democratic government will be set up, how everyone's going to concede, and every part of the new opposition coalition is going to support this new democratic government. That reality is just inherently false, considering the fact that terrorist organizations are probably using the West to get into power and will reject the democratic ideals because they inherently contradict all the things that they hold into value, which is no support for minorities and no support and equality for women. Second of all, even if you buy the democratic government argument, there's still a 25% terrorist influence that I talked about already that opposes human rights and rejects democracy as a whole, so you don't even get that benefit. And number three, you're going to be supporting an anti-West coalition as a whole because you will be more angry about military contractors and all the human rights abuses that they do to the West, which is inherently bad because it fuels the terrorist counterinsurgency and allows more human rights violations to occur. So for all these reasons, because we're clearly winning on stability, we're clearly winning on democracy, and we're clearly winning on the actual Topicality and human rights, our strong vote for the negation side. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? Yeah? So I'm just going to go over the extra topicality, the argument, and then I'm going to go over just some weighing of the both worlds and the impacts. So starting my time now, starting with the extra topicality argument, the first thing I want to point out is if we're talking about abuse, each of their speakers has gone 20 seconds over time. It's adds up to a full minute of extra talking time. So if we're talking about abuse, since they've had a full minute of extra talking time, this actually outweighs any sort of abusive thing we would have had. It's abusive
point of order, this was never brought up in any other speech, and you said we go in overtime in the first speech, Nick should have brought this up.
It wasn't significant one time over, but every single time it becomes more of an issue. But you can decide whether to take into account or not. So, okay. So anyways, I still don't think abuse should be the hugest issue in the round. We're going to discuss it anyways, the issue of extra topicality. First, they dropped my partner's rebuttal to the issue. What we said was that real world, the way that this is carried out in the real world outweighs any sort of theoretical thing about the way the resolution is phrased. He said this isn't an extra move, it's a continuation of the intervention that occurs every single time we do an intervention. They never responded to this. They kept just saying there are two fiats, and there really aren't two fiats. When you go in and do an intervention, the goal of the intervention, especially when it's a NATO intervention, is to reinstate democracy in the area. And reinstating democracy isn't just defeating Assad, it's also helping them to set up elections. We're not controlling their their government. We're not setting up a new agency to form their government. We're just helping them to monitor the elections. This happens every single time. So in this round, you should prefer real-world interpretations of the words in the resolution, not just theoretical interpretations. In the real world, this plan is never carried out the way that the negation team wants us to. This really never happens. It's not, it's not that we're unpredictable. This is the way it always happens. You always have to help them set up elections. This happens in every single country, especially those in the Middle East. Recently, the West has helped. So here you should prefer the extra topicality argument. And net benefits, my partner can see this. We agree that the world should be the net benefits. This isn't really an issue in the round. So don't vote against on this because we're conceding it. It's not really a problem. But even if you don't buy the topicality argument, even if you think we were extra topical and it's abusive, you shouldn't vote against us for that. You should just take that part out of our plan and consider the impacts without it. So if you think that we're abusive, just reject the argument. Don't reject us as a whole. So you can still look at our plan as a
point of order. That's the argument. Your partner should have brought up in his first speech.
Okay, I'm just weighing and I'm going through the extra topicality and trying to go through the impacts in either scenario.
Under consideration.
Okay. So even if you don't buy the topicality argument, you should still buy our argument that we're saving lives here, because it really has nothing to do with whether or not we're setting up new elections. Our plan saves lives either way you view it. And so even if that portion was abusive, you should still look at the other part, because they really haven't contended that on any front. So first, their only rebuttal to our first contention was that they're military contractors. However, the second speaker on the negation conceded that there are not military contractors in NATO. So you can take away their only rebuttal to our point and look to all of the other impacts. They never rebutted the idea that 700,000 people are dead. They never rebutted the idea that there are going to be 3 million refugees really soon. And they never rebutted the idea that this is hurting Turkey and Jordan. Now, they say they want global impacts. Turkey and Jordan are heavily affected by this plan. We've seen Jordan's population Lebanon's population increase by 10% because of this plan. They're not able to deal with these refugees. It's a huge economic and political problem, decreasing the stability of the entire region, because you have all these refugees. They're coming from a war-torn country. They have nothing to do. The government doesn't know what to do with them. And so this is really an impact here you should be looking at. So you should really be voting for us on lives, even if you don't buy the topicality argument. But moving on to Russia, the thing about Russia that my partner brought up is that it's really a non-unique issue. We combat Russia, and in terms of NATO, we combat Russia all the time in terms of Syria, in terms of other countries. In terms of Iran, we're combating Russia right now. This really isn't a problem that's changing now. Russia knows we're opposed to Syria. We're also opposed to Iran. We haven't seen any decrease in U.S.-Russian relations. And furthermore, U.S.-Russian relations are as good as the affirmation of the negation team says. There's nothing to suggest that they would decrease. They're clearly beneficial to Russia, and nothing's really going to happen. Furthermore, these impacts were never terminalized. They never explained why any of these things were actually important to any of the net benefits. So you shouldn't vote on this. I'm not going to take another one at this time. So now I'm going to go into a world comparison. I'm going to compare the world of the affirmation to the world of the negation. Essentially, the world of the negation is, they conceded that Assad is going to fall. We said this many times, they agree. So Assad is going to fall in the world of the negation and in the world of the affirmation. But in the world of the negation, you're going to see a power void. I asked their second speaker, what is going to happen to all these rebel groups that you say are associated with terrorists? They said, oh, they're probably going to stay the same. They clearly don't solve for this issue. I asked explicitly what they think is going to happen, and they haven't solved for this problem. So in the negation world, you have a 100% chance of a power void occurring in these countries, and the power void will clearly be filled by all these groups that are discussing, all these groups that are 25% Al-Qaeda. And so you have this clear harm. It's inevitable that Al-Qaeda will be there, and it's also unlikely that there will be a democracy. However, if you vote for the affirmation plan, you're going to first end the loss of lives sooner. Even if you don't believe a democracy will be instated, even if you think Al-Qaeda will rule in the area, you're saving lives in the civil war. The civil war will be ending. We all agree with that, regardless of what happens after. So in the short term, the affirmation is clearly winning. We're clearly saving 700,000 lives. 7,000 refugees are leaving every night. We are winning on the short term, clearly. However, in the long term, we're also winning. In the negation world, you accept a 100% reality that Al-Qaeda is going to take, Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups are going to take over. They say these are the dominant ones in the region. However, the reason that they're so dominant is because this is the only way that other rebel groups can look for help. They look for help and they look for money and resources, and they see, well, the Western world isn't helping. Al-Qaeda is our only source of funding. This is why Al-Qaeda is so prevalent. However, if they have another source of funding, if they have another way that they can do it, that's what they're going to do. They want a democracy, so they want the West to help them. If the West helps, they'll be less likely to turn to Al-Qaeda. We're more likely to see democratic elections.
Point of order, that was never brought up in any other speech, the fact that they were looking for
That was brought up in my first speech when I talked about how there are short-term human rights problems and anti-West sentiment. I talked about how the groups are anti-West because there's no help. This isn't my initial point.
So the fact that they want
Under consideration.
Okay. Well, it's clear that the groups in Syria want democracy. This is also my first contention when I talked about my impact. I said that in Libya, people supported democracy and liked when the United States came in. I also said that that's the goal. This has also been discussed in the topicality argument. So essentially, in the affirmation world, yes, we accept that there's a small percentage that a terrorist could come into power. However, in the negations world, you have a 100% chance that Al-Qaeda or an affiliated group will take advantage of the power void, and in the affirmation plan would reduce that chance. We make it so there's a possibility for democratic elections in Syria, a possibility for all of these groups, all these conflicting rebel groups to form a coalition government. We are saving 700,000 lives and 7,000 refugees every single night that are fleeing the country. So for these reasons, for saving lives and for the long-term impacts, I urge a strong vote in favor of the affirmation team.
All right. We have counted the ballots, and we know the decision for the final round, but we're not going to announce it yet. Because before that, we want to commend the judges, without whom this tournament would not have been possible.
And for the 4th straight year, you did not win top judge.
Yes, for the 3rd straight year, I got 2nd. Next year. But yes, I think we'll all agree that this tournament has by far the best judges of any parliamentary debate tournament in the country. And so it is a great honor to be named the top judge of all the really great judges who are here. And that honor goes to someone in this room, Brian Pearson.
All right. Since this was a very interesting situation for me, all right, we have a split decision, and we have a 3-2 vote with 2 votes of the judges going for the affirmation and 2 votes going for the negation from the judges. And so this is the first time this tournament has ever come down to the floor vote. And on an 8-4 majority, the California Cup, which comes back to me, goes to Antonelli and Pearl. And thus, the 2nd place, the goblet, goes to Zepeda and Walsh. Good job, everybody. And so, RFDs?
We, I guess, will go model, so we'll go first. So, I actually thought the debate was. Oh yeah. I thought the debate was actually pretty easily resolved in the favor of the negative. I thought extra T was a very clear voting issue. I thought it was very clear that the affirmative was a topical. The text of the resolution is to only specify military intervention. The violation is that they add an extra plank about rebuilding democracy. There's really no functional we meet except for this contextualization that you usually do it in terms of military intervention, but that doesn't answer the textual basis of the resolution, which I think is part of the question. They have offense off ground standards. They're winning offense off ground. That the abuse story is the power vacuum arguments, and the predictability standards also get conceded. The reason why the affirmative could keep on adding infinite amounts of unpredictable planks, which means it would collapse the activity. The fairness vote is extended, collapse the activity, collapse fairness, and I feel that any response about rejecting the team at the argument is functionally new. I thought the theory show was a pretty clear reason to vote for the negative this debate. In terms of the independent voter about the specification, I didn't really see that had a large bearing that round because I would pull the trigger on extra T already. So, but even if you didn't resolve the extra T debate, and if we go to case, I feel that the case debate gets a little bit muddled, but I do feel that the negative is winning some pretty compelling link turn arguments as well as disadvantage offense that would independently outweigh benefits of the case. I don't think the negative gets traction off the PMC argument, but it's functionally conceded the couple link turns that the active NATO intervention would actually lead to comparatively more chaos and disruption in the future, specifically in a world where they isolate specific violent scenarios and sexism scenarios. Even if you win the argument that Assad is worse, there's still a propensity for a massive NATO intervention. They especially isolate a spillover effect that would go all across the Middle East because there'd be massive anger at a U.S. intervention, which I think would at least functions as terminal defense against the AF. So I guess I would vote off negative presumption there as well. And the Libya debate isn't really resolved either, so I don't really know how to address the Libya debate. So on the disads, Russian relations as well. I don't really know if I can grant the negative access off Russian relations. There is an argument about how economic relations check back. So I don't know if I can really address Russian relations, but though I guess there's a risk of offense in this issue that the negative gets access to proliferation. On the terrorism advantage, I do think the negative is kind of not really answering the depth of the uniqueness question. The uniqueness is that collapse is inevitable in the status quo, so it's only a question what we do post-collapse. In a world of the affirmative is able to, I guess, solve for that. I guess the affirmative is able to solve for that collapse because they have NATO troops there, and while the negative doesn't really have a risk of offense, but I think the fact that they have troops there is the abusive part of the plan text because it's not mandated in the resolution. So I vote off extra T, but that's how I evaluated each position independently. So that's what I felt.
Cool. So extra T is very similar to me. I think the beginning of the problem, just from like a pure strategy perspective, is the difference in the amount of time that the negative spends than the PMR, right? There's going to be a natural trade-off that happens anytime you're AF just because it's a 12 on 5. So in this round, the arguments that I see that are happening here is everything that Ryan said I agree with on extra T. I think that one thing I really want to highlight is the LOR argument that even if you win that the goal of intervention is to, you know, build up democracy, the resolution doesn't allow you to do so. So even if you are, you know, real world correct, you are debate wrong, right? I also think that you're dropping the argument that the negative is making that in the example of Iraq that the MG talks about, the military was the one that did the intervention and the State Department is the one that did the democracy building and like all the infrastructure stuff, right? So the combination of those two concessions, absent a counterinterpretation or a turn that extra T is good, I don't see how I can vote for the AF on extra T. I think that reject the argument, not the team, could be an MG argument, so I don't know why I would give that to you. And I think this abuse, because they are talking over their allotted time, is weird because it's a new argument in the PMR, and I understand what you're saying when you're like, it's the first opportunity for us to make it because the MO is where most of the abuse happened. But I think that if you want me to pull the trigger on something like this, you're going to have to spend more than a few seconds on it, right? Because this is like, disregard the rest of the debate because of this one thing that they did. And I don't want to debate against you, but as a judge, I didn't even notice they were doing that because once the timer went off, I just kind of put the pen on my ear, right? So I don't really understand a lot of things that are going on. So you just have to talk to me about that more for me to vote for it. This weighing mechanism, I also think was underdeveloped. I mean, I can understand the PMR argument where you're saying, look, we conceded it because we just agree that we can evaluate the world and still win the round, right? I don't really have a problem with that. And absent some explanation in the block on why the AF cannot do that, I don't know why I should give you the ballot, like as an independent reason to vote. Going on case, I actually disagree with Ryan. I think that I had spoken earlier that you should spend more time on T, so I don't think it's fair to just tell you that without telling you how. I think that the easy way for you to get rid of the case debate is look, coming out of the PMC, you concede this inevitability claim, right? Even if you win 100% of your case arguments on why the opposition to Assad is bad and covered with terrorists, you need to realize that Assad is coming down no matter what. And the opposition is taking power no matter what. So there are really only two worlds. The world of the squo, where the rebels take control and they're just filled with terrorists, or the world of the AF, where there's at least some chance that the Western countries, come in there. Even if the judge gives them some credit on every single one of their arguments, there's still a risk that you would be able to stop the terrorists from taking over. Does that make sense? And so in a world where there is some minute, inconsequential chance that the terrorists don't take over, and then there's a world where the terrorists take over, no doubt about it, I don't understand why I wouldn't at least, take a shot in the dark. Does that make sense? So when you explain that really quickly, you have more time to talk about extra T. And I don't think the debate is entirely over for you on that point, although I do think the MG really undercovers the position, right? I feel like you need to do a little bit more work than just we meet, basically, right? I think you should remember that when you're answering theory positions, that theory has multiple parts, right? An interpretation, a violation, the standards, and the voter. So you need to be making arguments like that are more varied, right? So your PMR has more options to win. So we meet, right, a counter-interpretation. You can talk about why their interpretation is bad, why your interpretation is good, and then you can talk about reasons why you wouldn't even want to vote on the position, right? Like fairness skews inevitable kind of stuff. I think that you just don't like kind of vary your argumentation enough on extra T to give your PMR like some realistic outs on that point. Yeah, do you guys have any questions?
Should I say something well on theory?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that absent a counter-interpretation, and there's no discussion of reasonability or competing interpretations within the round, I think that without a counter-interpretation, the we meet is kind of just defense at best. Also, there isn't a counter-standard or counter-standards that function. You just have defense on the standards, which means there's still a risk of offense on theory that I have to evaluate. And I guess that if I was going to evaluate the non-unique you went over time claim, there would have to be some type of prioritization between the actual abuse that happened versus the T abuse, because there's still a differential in the amount of abuse that actually happens. It's not just a black or white side constraint thing, and I think that issue would have to be resolved. But as a judge, I guess intuitively, topicality is a gateway issue, right? So for me, that would come before even any substantive discussion, whether like going over time limits or that type of abuse would outweigh any risk of the offense on the original interpretation. So, yeah. So the other judges, I guess.
Arguments, Sarah.
All right. Let's start on the T. As I've said in my paradigm, I have a fairly high threshold for voting for T, which doesn't mean I don't vote for it, but it does mean that if you guys screw something up, I don't give you leniency. There are specific reasons why I didn't vote for T, which, like, if you screwed up, like, one of them slightly, I may have been somewhat sympathetic, but there are just several that you're not doing enough work in the line by line. First of all, the explanation of why it's even a voter is stated without a warrant the first time you read it. The warrant only comes in the op block. That's a problem. Second of all, they tell you that there is no specific position that you're losing ground on. You are, I think in the member speech, like briefly mentioning that it's the power vacuum, but never really bringing that up again in the rebuttal. So I don't even know where exactly the ground is being lost. Then there is the argument, the we need argument. It was sort of unclear, but I understood that somewhat as we meet, but also as sort of a turn to predictability. The interaction of arguments wasn't explained that well, but I basically understood, and I think they said the word predictability when they were explaining the argument, that because this is the sort of thing that NATO does, that means that it is predictable, which I see as offense on standards. And I don't really get weighing between that offense on standards, or perhaps why make ground be more important than predictability, but also you don't really get even ground that much because I don't see clear line by line from extended from each speech to the next point that we really needed that power vacuum argument, right? And so the combination of these issues means that I'm not voting on T. Second place where the net could win was the net benefits argument. I mean, I agreed with it, but I didn't even understand as a voter. Like, you just said it, and I was like, okay, fine, net benefits in the world. And then in the op block, you were like, this is a voter. I was like, where the hell did that come from? And also, yeah, first of all, that was new in the op block. Second of all, no warrants and why that's a voter. Yeah, I'm just giving you the argument, but not the ballot on that. On case debate proper, I think the affirmative arguments are devastating. So let's go through the places where the neck had offense. First of all, the terrorist thing, right? First of all, just to clarify a factual error, if I remember correctly, Hezbollah is a terrorist group that's backing Assad right now. And I think Hamas, although Hamas has been somewhat distancing itself from Assad, nonetheless, still not part of the rebels. Al-Qaeda is definitely on the side of the rebels, however. That has to do with like Shia and Sunni things. Also, one other terminological thing that bugged me was the teams referencing to these groups as Islamic as opposed to like Islamist, because they're all Islamic. It's Syria, like 99% of the population there is Muslim. Islamist as a political ideology as opposed to religion. Nonetheless, I think that on the terrorist al-Nusra point, the affirmative is very clearly winning because you guys are losing the uniqueness. You're actually conceding the uniqueness, which says Assad will fall, for sure. Even if we don't intervene, he will still fall. That means that eventually al-Nusra will take over anyway because he's bound to fall. But they're saying that if NATO intervenes, al-Nusra will be like less of a factor, right? So I think that's functionally a turn. Then let's go to Russia. There, you're just conceding the argument, like the economic argument, that there is no reason why there will be a nuclear explosion from this, because Russia has ties to NATO countries, most of which are in Europe, right? Just no ink there, and I think that you do a really shoddy job on the link story to like get to those nuke things. Then you have this argument about contractors. I think that you're not winning there for two reasons. First of all, because I don't think that outweighs. More importantly, because they just straight up say, nope, NATO does not use contractors. And you just don't respond to that. So that's 100% takeout. And then I have very clean extensions from the first contention on the AF, which says they are saving tens of thousands of refugees, tens of thousands of people, then they're helping millions of refugees. I think this is by far the biggest impact in the round, so I feel very comfortable pulling the trigger on that. Finally, on the anti-Western sentiment, there's some offense on both sides, but I don't really care because the impacts there weren't well terminalized by either side. The closest thing I got to an impact was trade. First of all, trade with Syria. Come on. But second of all, that doesn't outweigh any impact anywhere. So regardless of which side won that piece of paper, I don't really care. So yeah, for me, it was a pretty clear F ballot.
All right.
I vote almost identically to Artem, both on the extra topicality argument, because normally I have a much lower threshold for extra topicality, which is in my paradigm. But I thought that they answered your shell very well with the real world impacts, that you never have a case where the NATO just goes in with military troops and just like immediately pulls out. Like, he goes down and we go home and let chaos happen. So I think with their real world example, it was an answer enough for me when I was looking at that argument. And so at the point in which you lost the extra topical argument, their case was just so much stronger in terms of impacts, because you really didn't respond enough to their argument. You didn't respond at all to the fact that they're saving lives and the refugee arguments, because that is so huge. And they did a good job of taking out your nuclear proliferation arguments, because at the point in which they have there's no reason for them to do it, because they give examples of where we've had conflicts with other countries that Russia has ties with, and they haven't yet done that. So, they have predictability there because they're giving me real world examples. So just at the end of the day, they have more, their case arguments have a lot more offense at the end of the round than you do, and you don't end up winning the extra T. So I don't rehash because it's pretty much the same.
All right, and since the floor vote decided all of you have to explain why you No, thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming. Congratulations, Actionally and Pearl. Congratulations, Walsh and Zepeda. I'm spoiled as a coach. All right, and well, that's it. So until next year, guys.
I am 7 for 7 this tournament. I'm not doing